All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to No Kings on the Hill. I'm Dr. Hill. Thanks for joining us tonight on episode 34. We are live every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern. Running a little late tonight. Sorry about that. On Rumble, X, and Facebook at the Patriots Prayer Network, and on YouTube and Facebook at No Kings on the Hill, and on X at Dr. Hill Law 42, and on Kick at No Kings on Twitch this week at No Kings on the Hill. And if you can see our website down at the bottom of the screen scrolling, please go ahead and check that out and make sure to follow us there. You can follow all of the you can follow all of our sites from there and everything, and see all of our sites on that. So please do that. And sorry, I was just double checking. I forgot to double check one other thing before I set up. That's why I paused for a second, just trying to make sure I'm have all my videos up where I can see them. There we go. Alrighty. So that is where you can also access all the links to our social media accounts, previous episodes, and other ways to keep up with what's going on with the show. There you can subscribe for free and have access to our weekly blog. If you'd like to help us grow this platform, you can subscribe to one of our paid tiers, which allows us to continue growing and gives you perks as a subscriber, including but not limited to guest hosting opportunities, subscriber-only live streams, Discord chats, and even a say in what we talk about next. And as always, if you're able to leave us a review, we'd love to know how we're doing. So leave us a review to help us improve the show and reach more people. Washington poured federal loan dollars into higher education for decades. Colleges reacted as subsidized industries tend to do. They grew, raised prices, and created programs at a rate faster than the real economy could hire the graduates. So the impulse to reform is understandable. The trickier question is how to allow principled exceptions for areas that the country truly needs without letting the executive branch start making up categories that Congress does not define. But for now, let's get into it. Tonight, I want to begin with a sentence guaranteed to make at least part of the higher education establishment see red. Washington's student loan program helped colleges become subsidy-addicted businesses. Once Uncle Sam started handing out ever-increasing amounts of money, colleges behaved pretty predictably. They built new programs, jacked up prices, hired administrators, and kept selling credentials whether the job market had space for those graduates or not. So first things first, let me make my views on the underlying policy absolutely clear. I think there's a lot to like in the broad idea of saying no more federal subsidies for every hyper-local degree program imaginable, and it's honestly what I propose. If a school cannot point to a serious track record of placing students in jobs within a reasonable amount of time at wages that reflect that investment, maybe the default should not be instant federal loan dollars. That is not heartless. That is pricing reconnection with value. And honestly, I don't think most Americans have bought what higher education is selling for quite some time. They do not necessarily know higher education law from their elbow, but they know that something feels off. They know tuition is too damn high. They know colleges spend all this money on new bureaucracies, brandologists, and boutique degrees, while families get the friendly advice that simply taking on more debt will solve all their problems. They know kids go to school for years only to find that the career path they were sold doesn't pan out. The hours are too long. The pay is too little. There was no job waiting for them after graduation. So when politicians say the federal government will no longer blank check every questionable program into perpetuity, the average person does not hear penny pension. They hear accountability. Stopping colleges from turning every interest group cause into a four-year degree touches on much of the same frustration. Americans are sick of systems where risks are socialized, failures are rewarded, and everybody else is told just to fork over more money. Then experts descend and tell us that reform just isn't realistic. It's going to upset the system too much. Why do higher ed and its defenders always get the benefit of that doubt? For decades, people asking if a degree actually leads to marketable skills have been shouted down as elitist, horrible human beings, uncaring monsters who just want poor kids to suffer. But guess what? When it comes to student loans, some majors really are different. Nursing is different from most fields. Education is different. Law enforcement and public service sectors of all kinds are different. And the difference is that Congress will have to draw those lines. Congress passed legislation imposing new loan limits. The Department of Education issued a final rule on May 1st of this year explaining who qualified for the higher professional degree cap. On May 19th, multiple states sued the department, arguing that it narrowed that category. The department was contradicting the law itself on how those designations should be made. Tonight's episode is therefore both a policy and constitutional episode. The impulse to reform is the right one, but there is a legitimate legal question about this administration executing Congress's will or subtly rewriting it. Here's the big picture. This is how the administrative state works a lot of the time. We all sort of agree that something needs to change. Congress passes a law with broad categories that someone needs to define. Then the fun starts once an agency gets to decide what actually fits in those brackets. At that moment, the government is doing far more than merely executing the law. It's deciding who pays the price, who gets exceptions, who receives the benefits, who matters, and who does not. That is where our Constitution comes back into play. Tonight, I want to thread the three threads together. One, I want to make the case for that liberals and conservatives should both be able to support ending pointless federal subsidies. Two, I want to talk through where I think public service majors and professional degrees with real licensing requirements are different. But third, I want to show why that distinction still needs to come from Congress, not the administrative state. If we can do those three things in the next hour, we will have accomplished something. We can say, yes, the old system was unfair. Yes, it needs to change. And yes, those changes still need to actually reflect congressional priorities instead of a bureaucrat's best guess. That is the takeaway. Here is how we argue it. Let's start with why liberals and conservatives should care about this issue. So segment one is going to be why conservatives want this. And then I'm going to try to take a drink and then see at the comments that I've got. Oh, no, just somebody trolling. So, all righty. Well, I will get going and let's get on to segment one. Okay, so before we get there, let's talk policy in broad strokes because I don't want to sidestep that. Conservatives like these loan reforms because the previous systems incentivized universities to run like federally subsidized businesses. Expand programming, market aggressively to sign students, and treat enrollment as your own bottom line. If Washington will lend into nearly any graduate major at nearly any cost, you have every reason to do those things. None of this is hypothetical. Schools bulked up with niche master programs, administrative credential courses, and prestige signaling graduate degrees that sounded impressive on paper, but often didn't have much history of delivering solid earnings to match how many students they had pushed through. Students borrowed, hoping for big future payoffs. Colleges priced their programs with federal subsidies in mind. And think about it, how the messaging around so many of these choices was always morally leveraged. Universities sold these degrees as the opening of your dreams, opportunities, and life-changing transformations. They did not sell them as risky financial products. They did not walk students through the point. By taking this loan, this credential could leave you tens of thousands of dollars in debt with no significant labor market advantage. They did not say we offered this program in part because federal loans made it lucrative for us to expand into vanity niches that students want, but the private market could otherwise not have paid for. And when that cycle catches, you start choking the labor market. You end up oversupplying graduates relative to high-paying jobs, borrowers with more debt than their earnings power should justify, and young Americans who find out the hard way that a degree they were sold as their ticket to the professional class won't even cover the cost of living that said lifestyle purports to require, or they end up working as a barista at Starbucks. Loans are why the reform impulse is important. If the government lends willy-nilly, it is not acting compassionately, as subsidizing institutionalization while socializing risk. The school gets its payment no matter what, but the students don't get the outcome. The administrator can pat themselves on the back for building this empire. The borrowers get stuck with the debt, and the taxpayers get stuck with the bill if the whole operation doesn't pan out. Conservatives should be able to say something more lucid than attacks and think pieces. Republicans aren't opposed to education. We're opposed to subsidies that disconnect cost from consequence. If you're purchasing something in a free market, the seller has every reason to care whether what they sold you was worth what you paid. We smashed that rule. Universities could charge more because students had more student loan debt. Students couldn't be cajoled into that loan money because an entire culture had been conditioned to believe that going to college was beyond critique. Politicians could brag about making college more accessible without regarding to whether graduation meant you had any sustainable economic agency. That is why I think we need to have an honest conversation about whether federal loans should be backing graduate programs or not, even undergraduate programs with little to no track record of placing students in related employment within 2 years at salary levels that meet or exceed, I don't know, median household income. I mean, doesn't that it matters? If a degree can't cut it there, why should the federal government automatically fund students who want to pursue it? Why should American taxpayers who work in trades, farms, and small businesses or service jobs be forced to subsidize graduates pursuing degrees when real world employers haven't paid to educate those students for generations? To be fair, I'd word that rule somewhat differently. Not all degrees take the same time to hit wage targets. Not all forms of public service pay as much as private sector jobs. But broad strokes, the principle of federally backed loans being tied to some measurable value added to the student borrower is far less insane than previous assumptions that educational aspiration should be enough to merit federal support. And it's not to say that these kids can't go and get these degrees. They just need to pay for it with cash or go get a private loan. Because the thing is, if there's no market open for that job, or not a high chance that those kids will be able to get a job to pay that loan off, guess what? The free market's not going to give out that loan. And to me, that argument has a civic corollary that gets lost too often. Every dollar we spend subsidizing degrees we know are unlikely to cover their own cost is a dollar we're not investing more responsibly somewhere else. This isn't just about what students should or should not want. It's about whether the federal government should continually ramp up those wants into financial obligations that tactfully reward colleges for bloated bullshit curriculum and low graduation rates. If the federal government wants to help people build productive lives for themselves, it should stop treating every graduate degree as an equally valid intervention. That is why the new caps don't suddenly appear out of nowhere. Graduate students got lower annual and aggregate limits under the changes Congress passed in 2025. Professional degree programs got a new higher tier channel. The old model of essentially unlimited graduate student lending is being reined in. If you're upset about that on conservative policy grounds, I don't know what to say. It isn't a scandal, it's past due. My only concern is the six-figure exceptions. Limits are one thing, exception requests are another. Who do you give that power to? And what programs will you place above the level of scrutiny you apply to every other college major? All graduate programs should be eligible to apply for an exception from loan limits by demonstrating robust earnings among graduates and a strong track record of placing students in their fields. Exception statutes should be granted on a rolling basis. It can be revoked if market conditions change and programs can't prove that they are still meeting wage and placement standards. Give pilots a few years to prove themselves. If they work, great. If not, we limit the damage by rolling back exceptions and keeping loan levels in check. Programs that meet certain criteria for exception statuses are awarded a special designation from the Department of Education. Putting this in writing forces politicians to actually defend these decisions if they want to load up on giveaways during the next election cycle. Use extensive record checks to prove credentials. If colleges lie their way into exception status, the penalties should be severe. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. So what do you think about this general approach? I mean, we've got so much student loan debt, it's not funny. And we've got these kids going out there to get a bachelor's degree in French feminist studies. Like, while no education or no knowledge is useless, that degree in the real world is useless. No, what are you going to get a job doing with a degree in French feminist studies or gender studies? You're not. There might be one or two in the whole world, unless you're going to go for your doctorate or your PhD and be a professor in that field. There's no real world application for those degrees. And that's the problem. We get all these kids that they're going to get degrees because the degrees interest them, because the colleges want to get more people in there. So they've created degree programs to increase their enrollment rates, not necessarily increase their graduation rates or their completion rates. They don't not really caring about what happens to the kids once they're out, because they get that money no matter what. They don't have, if the kids don't pay their debt, the schools don't have to give money back. The schools aren't responsible for it. If the kids don't graduate, the schools don't have to give that money back. They still get it. So they don't care. They'll do whatever they can. They've started working like businesses. They'll do whatever they can to get more people in there to apply for the funds. And that's simple as that. Now, obviously, there's got to be some exceptions, and that comes to the next segment. Segment 2, the exception question. And I get it. And here's where my position gets both more interesting and I think more honest, because not all degrees should necessarily be treated equally. If a program has poor placement, poor earnings, and no identifiable public reason to exist, federal lending should not act as a subsidy on steroids. But some categories do have a better argument for exemptions. For example, nursing is the clearest example. We have chronic shortages across the country, particularly in rural and underserved areas. Licenses, actual skills people need to do an obviously valuable job in the real world. The same basic logic applies to an extent to teaching and to law enforcement or any other public service oriented tracks in criminal justice or social services. These aren't boutique credentials or prestige gambling stations. They're vocational training for professions that plainly require more workers. And they matter in part because they're linked to some tangible social good. Nurses, teachers, and police officers keep our social fabric intact, whether we realize it or not. We don't have enough nurses. People wait longer for care, and rural hospitals are closing. Simple as that. And obviously, they don't make a lot of money, but you have the PLFS and other loan forgiveness for first responders and teachers, anyways. So obviously, those exceptions need to be put in there. But obviously we don't have enough qualified teachers, and it doesn't show up on a PowerPoint slide. It shows up in your child's classroom. You cannot attract enough young people to become police officers or to enter related public safety jobs, and everyone pays the cost. Of course, none of these categories is automatically sacrosanct. An overpriced nursing program is still too expensive. An education school can still leave students with weak placement stats. But the onus shifts where a line of work demonstrably serves a public need, requires real skills, and has clear hiring needs. Regardless of pay scale, the federal government should have a stronger rationale for letting students borrow to pursue it. And that's why conservatives should avoid two lazy impulses on this issue. The first impulse is cynicism, where every program at every university is used with equal suspicion and disdain. Colleges aren't all intentionally selling diplomas to dead-end jobs, nor are they all primers on entitlement thought, where a lot of them are, though. The second impulse is sentimentality. Nursing, education, public service, bam, free pass. Anything that seems noble or important in a textbook deserves federal subsidies, immunity from regulatory scrutiny. Don't fall into that trap either. This is nuanced. Even with real exceptions, there should be standards. Students still matter, even in important fields. Taxpayers still have the right to some evidence that loans are lending to real gainful careers. That's why my view isn't just some silly slogan. It's actually a policy position with real ramifications, because if you're not arguing borrow for anything or no borrowing at all, you're arguing that the federal government should take seriously the difference between programs that prepare students for jobs and those that mostly convert federal grants into tuition revenue. But once you accept the former point, a challenging question remains. How do we define the exceptions? And here's where well-intentioned policy can run into really dumb politics. There are two ways to draw the line. Congress can pass a law that specifically says which categories qualify and why, or they could point to job placement records, earnouts, licensure requirements, public service designation, whatever. Alternatively, Congress can write a vague law and let the Department of Education draw those boundaries via rulemaking, which is what they usually do. If we went with option one, we'd all be arguing about the decision on Capitol Hill. Is licensure more important than raw earnings data? Do we make exceptions for shortage occupations in rural communities? Should we pay attention to state demand signals? What happens if a program has terrible completion rates, but a teacher's a fundamentally valuable profession? Tough questions, but Congress should be tackling tough questions. That's what they're there to do, or they're supposed to be there to do anyways. If the Department of Education later makes these decisions through regulations, some of these calls are still being made, but accountability suffers and the real choices get buried in legalese because we can't go after the administrative agencies. We can't hold them responsible through voting. We can only hold congressional members, House and Senate responsible. One is politically difficult, but administratively clear. The other is a convenient shortcut with serious risks attached. It lets the government decide which careers are valuable enough to subsidize and which are not. If any agency can do that at scale, it's likely to yield sensible results. It will also lead to arbitrary and potentially politicized determinations that reflect administrative convenience more than reasoned legislative judgment. Look, I don't know how these lines should be drawn, but I know who should draw them. Congress should write the law. If they want USDA approved programs, let's argue about what qualifies on the Hill, or if they want whatever approved programs. And there's a practical consideration with all this as well. Once you let an agency pick the lines, they will almost certainly be gained by interest groups, forwards and backwards. There will be pressure from schools, lobbyists, taxpayers, administrators, think tanks, donors. The list goes on. Unfortunately, this can happen at congressional level too, and it usually does, but not as much at the agencies, because they have to do public when they're doing policy or putting these policies up, they have to do public comment. And unfortunately, the majority of your average day, everyday Americans don't show up to make public comments. It's the think tanks, donors, administrators, lobbyists, the schools that actually have people showing up to make those public comments. So when those people flood a Department of Education working level committee meeting to argue about what public safety really means or where to draw the earnout cutoff, someone will have to draw that line. Congress will probably have to split the difference on difficult questions. Agencies then simply harden those categories because, well, they like to simplify. Congress, in theory, at least owns that policy decision. A few final points before I wrap this segment up. Get these rules wrong, and schools will game the system for undergraduate degrees, just as they did with graduate programs. Colleges lean into loopholes. When you create loopholes, colleges lean into them. It's all worth mentioning that these categories, once bureaucracies create them, are hard to be undone. They get carved pretty much into stone. Schools will quickly recognize their programs to fit the available categories. Lobbyists will rise in the name of small nurses. Students will learn about them and plan their lives around them. States will start making their own workarounds, which further embeds poor policy decisions into the education ecosystem. Don't underestimate how much policy can change just because a statute, words on page whatever, you just have to. Which brings me back to my original point. The smartest version of conservatism on this issue, in my opinion, is to say, yes, there should be loan discipline. Yes, there should be narrowly tailored exceptions. And yes, those exceptions should be written in the law, not improvised by future administrations. Well, past that point, and which is how we arrive at the statute and the lawsuit. So before I get started on segment 3, which is what the law actually says. Oh, okay. Don't get what those are. Just a bunch of trolls. Okay. No, really. It's only what, Charlie? It's only one credit. What? All right. So don't see anything there. I was just checking, seeing what comments I have going and see if there's anybody to answer, but don't see any. So I will get going. All right. So now on to segment 3, what the law actually says. So far, it's been about policy. Now let's turn to the actual legal text. When Congress differentiated between graduate and professional students in the 2025 law, it did two things. First, it linked graduate students to professionals, and then it tied that link to an existing regulation that defined the term professional student. According to the complaint filed by the states, the existing regulation further defined a professional degree as one that signifies completion of the academic requirements for beginning practice in a profession, requires skills beyond those of a bachelor's degree, and generally involves licensure. Then the regulation listed examples including health, psychology, clinical psychology, optometry, and pharmacy. The last word matters. When used in that context, include but are not limited to usually means what it sounds like to most people. Yes, these are examples of X, but they are not the only things that qualify as X. So if a program meets the definition of professional provided in the regulation, it cannot be denied professional status simply because it wasn't one of the examples provided earlier in the regulation. Say that last sentence to an originalist, textualist audience, and you should see a bunch of immediately raised hands. We preach all the time that words matter, structure matters, and that choices made by legislatures matter. Well, here we have an agency that decided those examples were functionally exhaustive despite the regulation saying the exact opposite. They chose to insert a non-exhaustive definition of a professional student into the law. That is a choice with consequences. If not, textualism is just cosplay that can be put away when it's not convenient. Unfortunately, in May 1st final rule read that of the education departments of May 1st final rule read that word differently. According to the states, the education department treated the traditional examples as a near complete list and then decided to add clinical psychology. Under that interpretation, several healthcare related graduate entry programs fall into the lower cap despite meeting Congress's broader definition. I want to be charitable to the administration's position here as long as possible. They argue that the old lending system contributed to tuition inflation and that these caps are designed to rein that inflation in. And I agree. Obviously, the administration is also arguing that its alienation for loan limit purposes is not meant to slight the excluded professions. It's meant to administrate this new statute in a coherent way. You can and should make policy arguments against these points. The problem is that a good policy argument against an administrative rule does not inherently win you the statutory argument. I say this as someone who tends to agree with the administration on the merits. It's an important lesson for folks who operate primarily at the outcome layer of public controversies. You cannot support the outcome while still thinking the method was bad. In fact, often that is precisely where constitutional fidelity is tested. Nobody has to defend the Constitution when the Constitution lets them do what they wanted to in the first place. The test comes when the Constitution obstructs, delays, or complicates a process you believe in. Conservatives should find that test useful because right now we are being given plenty of opportunities to run from our own rhetoric. At the statutory level, the states argued that the department didn't merely implement congressional directives, it revised those directives. They argued that the education department relied on criteria that Congress didn't include, relied on context too narrow rather than clarify ambiguous categories, and cut against clear grandfathering provisions to limit protections for current students. But differently, they aren't saying the result isn't what we would have wanted. They're saying the department changed how the law operates. I want to linger on that grandfathering point for a second. Transition rules always tell you how aggressively an agency will interpret a statute. Congress creates these implied protections for students already enrolled in programs, but then the agency interprets the scope of that protection narrowly so that fewer people qualify, which means more people are shocked when their grace period turns out to be a trapdoor. Those choices deserve scrutiny because they speak directly to whether an agency views its job as executing Congress's will or squeezing every restriction out of a new law. Another statutory angle, if Congress gives an open-ended definition with examples, agencies can't casually turn it into a near complete list because the narrower list better aligns with agency policy. If Congress wanted a complete list, it would have written one. The fact that it did not, is why we're here. There's also a constitutional dimension here. Cross-references like the ones used to define professional student are a way Congress uses to restrain the administrative state. When Congress says at this moment in legislative history, use that definition as it is, they are narrowing administrative discretion. They are saying to cabinet. So when the executive branch interprets that static cross-reference in a way that meaningfully narrows that category of people it covers, courts should ask whether the agency is leading within the confines of congressional design or quietly undermining that design. The public service exception comment raises a similar issue. Sure, we should treat nursing and other fields differently. Great, Congress can make that decision by editing the statutory language to say so explicitly. Until the department has no grounds to claim it can't touch these fields because Congress made a separate but related decision to include those programs in a broader category of professional students. Here's another way of framing the problem. The department can't use flattering facts about specific schools or degrees to enable an unfriendly reading of the law. Nursing students aren't overborrowing. Point accepted, but that facts does not give the department license to reread the phrase professional students in a way that suddenly excludes nursing. Does anyone else smell a constitutional violation? The administrative branch can point to problems with the old system all at once. Tuition inflation, moral hazard, institutional greed. These were real problems, and a lot of those critiques are fair. But just because of how universities behaved prior to 2022 does not give the administration a free pass to ignore how Congress asked them to read the new rules. Listen to courts when they say the agency's best argument is what you shouldn't want your agency arguing. The best argument for this rule is why we shouldn't let universities continue to sell students in the debt peonage. That is not what Congress wrote. If Congress wanted that argument, they would have written a statute that made that case. Instead, they wrote a much narrower bill that relies on an old regulation to define its terms. And before, kind of going a little bit off topic, but before the Chevron deference was repealed, I would say that the people challenged in this case would lose, the agency would win. But now that Chevron deference has been reversed, and so now the deference is not given to the agency; it's judged by the courts based on what the Congress wrote. I have a feeling that this case will go in the favor of the plaintiffs, not the state or the federal government. So the legal question here isn't whether universities need discipline. The legal question is whether this administration used a real statute to serve Congress's intentions or used a real statute as cover for its own intentions. And that brings us back to the constitutional question at the heart of this dispute. So the constitutional policy tensions on segment 4. I'll get in a second. Let me take a drink. Trying to see if there's anybody in comments. Nope. Do not see anything. Sorry. Anybody that's in TikTok, please like, repost, share, tap that screen. Let's get the likes up. I will take multi-guest and chat after I get done with my podcast on the YouTube and everything for the hour. So for now, I am not taking anybody up, but once I get done with I've got about another 30 minutes. And at that time, then I will take up guests on TikTok. So please, anybody that's also watching on YouTube, X, Twitch, Facebook, hit that like button, share, repost, follow, help get these pushed out past just the lives and try to get out further. And also engage in the comments if you have a question or want at me answer a question or want to put your own input on this, please do. And I will try to answer them or call them out whenever I get in between segments. So let's get that engagement up so we can get more people in here. All right. So segment 4, the constitutional policy tension. Okay, this is my favorite part of the episode. The administration is right about the stupid old system. The states may be right about this regulation, but both of those things can be true simultaneously. That is why the constitutional argument matters. Our system doesn't allow ends to justify branch chaos. Congress makes laws, the executive branch implements laws. Agencies get discretion to administer, but they don't get to have a roving warrant to finish policymaking debates Congress left half done. If legislators want to say federal loans should only go towards career paths with demonstrable track records of employment and earning after graduation, they can say that. If legislators want carve-outs for nursing programs, education, policing, or other public service concerns, they can write those rules as well. I bring this up at length because it speaks to the health of self-government itself. When Congress kicks tough policy lines like this to agencies, voters can no longer easily identify who's actually accountable for the decision. Lawmakers get to take credit for big reform goals without having to own tough policy lines that inspire backlash. Agencies get to write the on-the-ground rules without admitting they are actually making policy. Everyone else is left arguing over consequences, but without knowing who to blame or being able to vote somebody out for the blame. What they shouldn't be able to do and what courts should be skeptical of is to legislate a broad statute, then let an agency pick the real winners and losers through definition. That is how you slowly, quietly hand control of the law to the administrative state. Voters see rules, bureaucrats see boxes, and those boxes become proxies through which policy is rewritten. This is doubly true for conservatives because we are often tempted to excuse administrative overreach when the outcomes are ones we like. We should push back against that instinct hard. If we aren't willing to let agencies rewrite labor law, environmental law, or firearms regulations to suit executive priorities, then we shouldn't let them rewrite definitions of education finance programs just because we like the broad goal of reform. We always feel this impulse more strongly when the bureaucracy seems to be doing something our side has wanted for ages, which goes both ways, left or right. but it is also when our intellectual convictions matter most. If we're going to claim a fidelity to the separation of powers, we shouldn't only care about when Republicans are in office. A movement that upholds constitutional norms only against their political opponents is no longer a principled movement at all. It is a political coalition holding the Constitution as a convenience. If we want to stand for something greater than that, we should be willing to say that just because the law reform is politically convenient does not make it a lawful reform. Obviously, the flip side of this point is that I don't think challengers should be allowed to embed a defense of the prior blank check system in their arguments. They should not get to say X, Y, and Z programs have been defined as healthcare, therefore they should continue receiving subsidies. The prior system was exactly what made higher education break loose. Blaming that on Congress and solving it through endless subsidies is not a solution. The solution is rewriting the law and making Congress actually do their job. But we can, I guess, pray in one hand, shit in the other, and see which one fills up. And it's probably going to be the shitting in the hand that fills up first, because Congress can't get shit done. Let me phrase that. The House can get stuff done, but the Senate under Leader Thune's leadership can't get shit done. And it's why Leader Thune needs to be removed from leadership, and somebody needs to replace him that can actually get legislation through the Senate to President Trump's desk. I think framing this dynamic can help conservatives sound smarter than either side's advocates are sounding right now. To the Trump administration, the problem with tuition price distortion may very well be what you say, but that doesn't give you the license to ignore the text that Congress wrote. To the suing states, the problem with undifferentiated professions may very well be what you say, but that doesn't vindicate the old model of student loan financing. The reason both of these points are valuable is that they allow you to say no to a false choice. A lot of unserious public discourse works because it forces people into one of two boxes. You either defend any existing subsidies or you trust the executive branch to eradicate them at will. There is a third option, though. And it's the option I think this controversy should reside in. Reform the standard, write it clearly, conserve exceptions that further the common good, and let the right branch draw the line. In other words, Congress, not administrative agencies, not the administrative state. All right, so trust but verify. And there is a citizenship bonus for speaking this way too. Part of what gives people faith to public power isn't rigged, is knowing who gets to make the rules. All right, so that's another problem that we need, is we need to know who's actually making the rules so we can hold them accountable. If you don't know if it's the administrative state or the Congress that's actually making it, how do you know to hold accountable? Once we carelessly transfer that power from Congress to agencies, we end up with rules that are harder to challenge, more expensive to unwind, and easier for large institutions to game, which was what we've seen over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, ever since we really have the creation of the administrative state. And anybody who thinks administrative law is legal, you should read the book, Is Administrative Law Lawful, or is Administrative Law Unlawful, by Philip Hamburger. And he actually relates it and shows how administrative law is just, it's not new. It's literally the Star, what was called the Star Court and the High Council back in the 1500s and 1600s in England. And even by mid 1600s, even the English people decided it was unconstitutional. And that's for a monarchy. If it was unconstitutional for a monarchy, because the power it gave the administrative branch, then it should be for America. Simple as that. So this brings me to my final point. This isn't just about student loans. If agencies can interpret vague terms to define the scope of cross-referenced categories with meaningful policy consequences, they can do it in all sorts of places. Healthcare reimbursements, environmental permits, labor regulations, gun classifications, federal grant programs, immigration offenses, everything. The words will change, but the game remains the same. Control the category, name the category, move the policy. To that end, courts should not ask if the agency picked a reasonable line in the abstract. Courts should ask whether the agency stayed within the lines Congress gave it, or if that is the constitutional question. And it is a far cry from both refuse to allow any reforms or automatically trust administrative improvisation. All right, so segment 5 is a better conservative reform agenda. I'm going to take a drink, start that in a second. Like I said, look at the messages, look at the comments, see if anybody's in. Please, like I said, like, repost, share, follow, tap that screen. Anybody that's watching and on the No Kings, my YouTube, please hit that follow button. Dr. Law on X, please like, repost, share. Let's try to get some more people in here and get this live going. We've got about 20 more minutes. So let me go ahead and get on to segment 5. Anybody that's in my TikTok, also please tap that screen, like, repost, share. Let's try to get some more people in here. We're at minute 42, so at 60 minutes, I will end the main podcast. And also anybody that wants to follow me over to my No Kings on the Hill TikTok page. Like I said, as you're seeing the RSS, the ticker feed across the bottom, wait for my podcast, my website page to come across there, which is No Kings on the Hill with drlaw.com. Go there, you'll find a link to my podcast, my TikTok, and everything like that. Follow and come join in after the show. So what I would do differently, I'll offer you a few suggestions here. So what should a better reform agenda look like? I think it starts by saying out loud what the old regime refused to say. Federal lending is not an entitlement for every academic product that universities decide to market. If a program can't show a credible record of graduates being hired within a reasonable window, say 2 years, at earnings that are at least a meaningful baseline average household income, then the presumption should be against federal subsidy. That doesn't mean you ban the degree. What it means is that the federal government doesn't automatically finance it, and taxpayers aren't put on the hold for it. If students still want it badly enough, let them pay for it with their own money or private financing. And yes, this is nothing anti-liberty about. There's nothing anti-liberty about that. Students remain free to study whatever they want. Schools remain free to offer whatever they want. The only thing that changes is that the federal government stops pretending it is obligated to subsidize every educational decision equally. That's a big deal. A lot of folks on the other side like to pretend that any rollback of subsidies is automatically an assault on liberty itself. Real freedom doesn't come with universal taxpayer underwritten attached. But I wouldn't make that the only metric either. There will be public service fields that can complicate the picture. You can imagine socially beneficial occupations, even if the pay doesn't look like private sector professional salaries right off the bat. That's why I allow Congress to legislate explicit exception categories for licensed healthcare professions, core teacher preparation, law enforcement, and other similar public or social service jobs where there's an actual labor shortage in the country. But even that exception should not be unlimited. A nursing school or an education school can't suddenly hide behind the nobility of its profession if it has awful completion rates, poor placement, or pricing is so far in that stratosphere that students can't hope to repay loans in a reasonable time frame. The goal isn't to create new protected classes of bad programs. The goal is to recognize that some career fields provide an actual public service that justifies a more tailored federal approach. And honestly, I'd attach some sunlight requirements on the school side of the equation as well. For any program that wants to accept federal dollars, colleges should have to disclose completion rates, average borrowing per graduate, time to degree, placement rates, and early career earnings in a way that ordinary families can understand. I mean, really spell it out. Don't bury it in a compliance booklet. Don't obfuscate it with marketing speak. Require colleges to lay it out plainly, all of it, in front of students before they sign the promissory notes. If schools are really confident about what they provide, transparency shouldn't be scary. We all know what happens when Congress tries this stuff. Forget marketing lawmakers pick precise lines in the sand. They can't even agree to demand hard transparency data before they hand out subsidies. Lawmakers don't like to get specific because specifics lead to political fights. They prefer to send vague instructions and let folks argue about the details later. But if Congress wants federal lending actually to become more disciplined, outcome oriented, then Congress needs to put that standard in the law. Define the metrics, draw the line, create the public service carve outs, demand reporting, require placement and earnings transparency, give schools clear notice. Federal support isn't automatic. That would help with constitutional accountability too. Voters could see who voted for what standard. Universities could lobby against the policy, though, the open political process. Agencies would administer the programs, yes, but they would not be unilaterally deciding what gainful employment looks like on some childish whim. Also, one more thing. Once Congress writes the necessary carve-outs for particular professions, Congress should review those exceptions. Don't let the exceptions become a permanent shield for the status quo. Look, if someone can provide empirical reasons these fields should continue to be exempt from the basic requirements, great. Keep the exceptions, but prove it. The mere existence of an exception shouldn't allow universities to pretend their standards don't apply. The point of the public service exception isn't that it sounds nice. Programs are exempt because they fulfill a civic need we can't afford to lose. If the data no longer justify that presumption, repeal the exception. I'd also add that any honest reform agenda should force colleges to internalize more risk. If a school knows poor outcomes threaten its ability to access federal loans down the line, it will have a greater incentive to reform pricing, staffing, and program decisions that don't benefit students. Right now, that's one of the key missing disciplines from modern higher education. Universities don't have strong incentives to ensure students thrive after graduation. In many cases, schools are rewarded simply for enrolling more students. Crap, they don't even have to really push or ensure that students stay in the class or graduate. They just have to make it past the like the first week or two whenever they consider taking roll or the count, and then or past the mid semester, and they get to keep 100% of that money. They don't have to refund any of it. They don't need them to finish a class, much less finish the program. If students don't complete a class, or a certain amount or a certain percentage of students don't complete the class fully, or do not graduate that class or pass it, then the federal government, the schools should have to get that money back. Period. Because obviously not every child, because there's going to be people who just won't try. There's going to be people who they're not just meant for college and they thought they were, and they're not going to pass it. But they also need to say, hey, look, you've failed too many classes. We can't keep giving you money. Obviously, college isn't for you. They need to be able to, they can't be afraid to say that. But they also need to be held responsible that if they're not really putting time into ensuring that these kids are learning and passing grades, then that they have to pay the money back. Because the taxpayers should not be on the hook for them just trying to get a bunch of money and become rich and look like businesses. I mean, it gets back to my original point. We have been conditioned to act like every degree a university offers is a presumptive public good. That should be a provable standard. Right now, it's not. If a degree can't show its value and still expect blind federal backing, we'll move closer to pricing, staffing, and design programs that recognize students and taxpayers, not just university balance sheets. So to me, the conservative case, properly stated, is not anti-student. It's not anti-learning. It's anti-subsidy when colleges won't take any responsibility for their own products. Taxpayers shouldn't be underwriting shitty economic bets in perpetuity. Public service ought to have exceptions. Should they be real but narrow? And Congress should write the basic policy, period. Agencies can handle the implementation, but constitutional government still requires the legislature, not bureaucrats, to draw the big lines. And that's the issue we have with the whole administrative state right now, is the majority, almost every bill that Congress writes, it's a broad, it doesn't cover the big lines. They cover just the broadness of it, and then they leave the rest of it up to the agencies. TikTok, I told y'all I'm doing my podcast. I'm streaming on YouTube, Twitch, Rumble, Facebook, X, and then I've got my phone streaming on TikTok. So no, I'm looking at my camera, not y'all. And I said, once I'm done with this, I will bring up the people on my Facebook, on my TikTok. And also anybody that's on Facebook or anyone, please come over to TikTok if you want. But let's go ahead and bring this home. The reform impulse undergirding this effort is a good one. Washington shouldn't continue to subsidize degrees that don't produce repayment through stable careers and living wages. Colleges and universities created a lot of this problem by gaming federal subsidies as if they were customers. Taxpayers should not be held hostage to banks calling that bluff. But constitutional government doesn't end with a critique of bureaucracy. It also demands that we ask who should decide if exceptions should exist. If nursing schools, education schools, police academics, and other inherently public service oriented or licensed industries should be treated differently, Congress should make that judgment. Congress should set the standards, force Congress to live with the trade offs created by those standards, and allow the public to debate those choices openly and honestly. What should not happen in a classic bureaucratic end run in which executive agencies interpret a vague, broadly worded statute into a far narrower policy because they prefer how the policy reads on paper. Definitions matter, categories matter, and once you let agencies control those definitions and categories, they almost always do far more than simply execute against the law. All right. The smart play here is to do neither. Don't defend the status quo blank check, and don't assume we can trust the bureaucracy to fix its own problems however it wants. Reform the system, tie the federal subsidies closer to market value and public need, and make Congress own those difficult decisions rather than delegate them. That is the constitutional lesson. That is also the policy lesson. Subsidies should serve a purpose. Degrees have to prove they provide value. And the branch of government that should make those value determinations is the branch of government the Constitution expects to make those decisions. That is the show. That's the show for today. Watch the Maryland case that was filed on May 19th. Watch to see if the department actually defends this narrow interpretation aggressively in court, and watch to see if Congress decides it wants to actually step up and clarify these standards rather than outsourcing that job to unelected bureaucrats. Thanks for listening with me and watching with me tonight on No Kings on the Hill with Dr. Hill, episode 34. If you liked the episode, if you found it helpful, if we helped you connect some constitutional dots behind the headlines, please like, subscribe, share this show with someone who needs to hear it, and leave us a review while you are at it. Tell us how you think we're doing. Where you think we're spot on, where you think we have missed the mark, what stories do you want us to cover next? As you see at the bottom of the screen, scrolling across, please check out No Kings on the Hill with drlaw.com. Please click over there and spend some time with us. That link will take you to all of our social links, past episodes you have missed, and ways that you can support the show. You can also subscribe for free to access our weekly blog. If you want to help support us and get access to some really great perks, you can subscribe to one of our paid tiers. Those subscriptions help us continue to grow and bring you more content. But our paid tiers also offer opportunities to engage with us, monthly opportunities to be a guest host on the show, subscriber-only lives, Discord chats, seriously, and help choose the topic. You even get to throw nominations into that for the next topic we cover the next week. And remember, we go live every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Central, 6 p.m. Eastern on Rumble, X, and Facebook via the Patriots Prayer Network and Twitch. Additionally, we are on YouTube and Facebook and at No Kings on the Hill, on X at Dr. Law 42, and Twitch at No Kings on the Hill. As always, we cut through the slogans, we cut through the donor memes, we cut through the political theater because this republic doesn't survive on hashtags. It survives when we drive toward truth. It survives when we re-engage with the law, with ordered liberty, with a constitution that actually means what it says. And if tonight's episode did anything useful, I hope it helped remind you that good policy and constitutional principles have to travel together. Being right about the problem is just half the battle. We have to be right about the solution, and we have to be right and do right about who has the authority to implement that solution. Otherwise, free people keep pulling themselves back from the cliff off reform, which is becoming a new era of rule by administrative convenience. So keep those coming. Keep letting us know what you want us to tackle next. Keep sharing this show with your friends, family, coworkers who you know are thirsty for something more than panic and screaming monkeys on cable news. You grow this with every share that you send our way, and believe me, I do not take that for granted. Until next week, stay informed, stay engaged, stay grounded in our Constitution, and remember, no kings on the hill, only we the people and the rule of law, and see you on the hill next week.